The morning sun cast long shadows across the perfectly manicured lawn of the Hale estate, but inside the sprawling beige mansion, darkness seemed to live in every corner. Richard Hale stood at his office window, watching the gardeners trim hedges with mechanical precision. Everything in his world was controlled, calculated, perfect. Everything except the one thing that mattered most. 18 months had passed since the accident that changed everything. 18 months since his wife Margaret had been driving Emily home from dance class on that rainy Tuesday evening. 18 months since the drunk driver ran the red light and turned their lives into a nightmare of hospital corridors, medical consultations, and crushing silence. Margaret hadn't survived the first night. Emily had fought for weeks in intensive care, her small body connected to machines that beeped and hummed with artificial life. When she finally opened her bright hazel eyes, the doctors delivered the verdict that shattered what remained of Richard's world: complete paralysis from the waist down. At 5 years old, Emily would never walk again. Richard had built his fortune in real estate, transforming empty lots into thriving communities. He understood construction, development, making something from nothing. But this was different. This was his daughter, his only child, trapped in a wheelchair while he stood helpless, watching her spirit fade day by day. The mansion felt like a mausoleum now. Emily rarely left her room except for physical therapy sessions that seemed to accomplish nothing but exhaust her tiny frame. She would sit by her window for hours, staring at the world beyond the glass, her wild blonde curls hanging limp around her pale face. The girl who once cartwheeled across this very lawn now moved through life like a ghost of her former self. Richard had tried everything money could buy. Dr. Patterson, the country's leading spinal injury specialist, had examined Emily 3 times. The experimental treatment in Switzerland had cost more than most people earned in a lifetime, yielding nothing but false hope and deeper despair. The robotic exoskeleton therapy in Germany had been the latest disappointment, leaving Emily more withdrawn than before. She's retreating further into herself, Dr. Sarah Mills, the child psychologist, had warned during their last session. The physical trauma was devastating, but the emotional isolation is becoming equally dangerous. She needs connection, joy, something to remind her that life still holds wonder. But how do you give wonder to a child who has lost everything? How do you explain to a 5-year-old that sometimes terrible things happen to good people? How do you restore faith when your own has been shattered beyond repair? The household staff moved through their duties with whispered efficiency. Mrs. Chun, the longtime housekeeper, brought Emily her meals on fine china that barely got touched. Thomas, the driver who had worked for the family for 12 years, polished cars that rarely left the garage. The mansion had become a beautiful prison, housing 3 broken souls who had forgotten how to live. Richard's business partners had grown concerned about his increasing absence from board meetings. His assistant fielded calls from worried associates who noticed his sharp mind dulling at the edges. But Richard couldn't focus on profit margins when his daughter was disappearing before his eyes. At night, he would stand outside Emily's bedroom door, listening to her quiet sobs that she thought no one could hear. He wanted to comfort her, to hold her close and promise that everything would be okay. But he couldn't lie to his daughter. Nothing was okay. Nothing might ever be okay again. The medical bills meant nothing to a man worth $47 million. The renovations to make the mansion wheelchair accessible had been completed within weeks. Emily's room now featured the finest motorized wheelchair, custom-built desk, and every adaptive toy money could purchase. Yet none of it could replace what she had lost. Dr. Patterson had been brutally honest during their last consultation. The damage to Emily's spinal cord is complete. Modern medicine has reached its limits. I'm sorry, Mr. Hale, but miracles aren't something we can prescribe. Miracles? Richard had stopped believing in those long ago. He dealt in facts, figures, concrete realities. Miracles were for people who couldn't afford the best medical care, who needed something to believe in when science failed them. But science had failed Emily too, leaving Richard facing a terrible truth. All his wealth, all his power, all his connections were worthless against the random cruelty of fate. The mansion's gardens bloomed with expensive flowers that Emily never asked to see. The swimming pool, once filled with her laughter and splashing, now sat covered and unused. The swing set Thomas had installed last spring remained motionless, a monument to dreams that would never be fulfilled. As afternoon approached, Richard found himself doing what he did every day at this time, watching Emily position her wheelchair by the garden window. She would sit there until dinner, occasionally turning the pages of books she wasn't really reading, her eyes fixed on something beyond the glass that only she could see. Today would be different, though Richard didn't know it yet. Today, something would happen that would challenge everything he believed about healing, hope, and the power of human connection. Today, a barefoot boy with nothing but joy in his heart would slip through the hedges and change their lives forever. Emily pressed her face against the cool glass of the garden window, watching clouds drift across the afternoon sky. The wheelchair felt heavier today, like it was pulling her down into the earth. She traced patterns on the glass with her finger, creating temporary art that would disappear with the next cleaning. Outside, the world moved in ways she remembered but could no longer join. Birds hopped across the lawn with effortless grace. Butterflies danced between flowers with movements that seemed impossible, defying gravity with delicate wings. Even the trees swayed with a rhythm she once felt in her own body, back when dancing was as natural as breathing. She had been the star of Miss Caroline's Dance Academy. At 4 years old, Emily could pirouette across the studio floor while other children struggled to stand on tiptoe. Her teacher had whispered to Mommy about natural talent and extraordinary grace. Those words felt like they belonged to someone else now, a different girl who lived in the time before everything changed. The afternoon stretched endlessly ahead. Physical therapy had been canceled again because Emily had refused to participate, lying still on the mat while the therapist moved her legs through motions that felt mechanical and pointless. What was the purpose of pretending her body could do things it would never do again? A flash of movement caught her attention. Something dark darted behind the tall hedges that bordered the estate's front boundary. Emily leaned forward, pressing harder against the glass. There it was again, definitely a person, small and quick, moving along the edge of the property. The figure emerged from behind a rose bush, and Emily's eyes widened. It was a boy, maybe a few years older than her, with skin the color of rich chocolate and hair that stuck up in wild directions. His clothes hung loose on his thin frame, and his feet were completely bare. He moved differently than anyone she had ever seen, not just walking but almost bouncing, like music played inside his body. The boy stopped near the fountain and looked around with curious eyes. When his gaze found Emily in the window, he didn't look away or seem embarrassed to be caught. Instead, he smiled, the biggest, most genuine smile she had seen since before the accident. Then something magical happened. The boy began to move, not walking anymore, but dancing. His arms swept wide. His body twisted and turned. His bare feet seemed to barely touch the ground. He wasn't performing for an audience or following choreography. He was simply letting joy pour out of him in the form of movement. Emily's breath fogged the window as she leaned closer. The boy's dance was unlike anything she had learned at the academy. There were no perfect positions or practiced routines. Instead, he moved like he was having a conversation with the wind, responding to music only he could hear. He spun in circles, jumped over imaginary obstacles, and threw his arms toward the sky as if he could catch the clouds. For the first time in 18 months, Emily laughed. Not a polite sound for the adults who tried so hard to make her smile, but a real laugh that bubbled up from somewhere deep inside. The boy heard it and looked directly at her through the window. His grin grew even wider, and he began dancing specifically for her. He exaggerated his movements, making funny faces, pretending to stumble and catch himself dramatically. He pointed at Emily as if inviting her to join him, then continued his performance with renewed energy. Emily found herself leaning forward in her wheelchair, her back straighter than it had been in months. Her hands pressed against the glass, and without thinking, she began to move her arms, trying to copy the boy's gestures. Her shoulders swayed slightly, following the rhythm he created with his steps. The boy noticed her movements and responded by making his dance even more animated. He dropped to the ground and rolled across the grass, popped back up, and spun like a tornado. Emily clapped her hands together, delighted by his fearless creativity. Something was happening inside her chest, a warm feeling she had almost forgotten existed. It was like watching the sun come out after months of gray skies. The boy's joy was infectious, spreading through the glass and filling the empty spaces in her heart. She didn't notice her father approaching the window from outside until the boy suddenly stopped dancing. Emily turned to see Richard standing on the patio, his face unreadable. Fear shot through her. Would Daddy make the dancing boy go away? Would he disappear like everything else good in her life? "Daddy, please," she whispered against the glass, though she knew he couldn't hear her. The boy looked between Emily and her father, his smile fading slightly. But he didn't run away. Instead, he straightened his shoulders and gave a small, respectful nod to Richard. Then, as if making a decision, he looked back at Emily and winked. The wink was like a promise. It said he would return, that this wasn't the end of their connection. Emily pressed both hands against the window, trying to send him the same message with her eyes. Richard stepped back, moving out of the boy's line of sight. The dancing boy's smile returned full force. He gave Emily an elaborate bow, the kind princes made in fairy tales, and then began to back away toward the hedge line. But he didn't stop moving. Even as he retreated, he continued dancing, making his exit as graceful and joyful as his performance. His final gesture was to blow a kiss toward Emily's window before slipping back through the hedge and disappearing from sight. Emily remained at the window long after he was gone, her heart pounding with excitement she hadn't felt since before the accident. Her cheeks hurt from smiling, and she realized tears were streaming down her face. But they were happy tears, the kind she thought she might never cry again. The dancing boy had given her something she thought was lost forever. Hope. Hope that joy still existed in the world, that beauty could find her even behind the glass, that maybe she wasn't as alone as she felt. Outside, Richard stood frozen on the patio, his mind racing. He had witnessed something impossible, his daughter's face alive with happiness, her body responding with movement he hadn't seen in over a year. The barefoot boy had accomplished in minutes what months of expensive therapy had failed to achieve. Tomorrow, Richard decided, he would be ready for the boy's return. Richard barely slept that night, his mind replaying the scene in the garden over and over. He had seen his daughter laugh, truly laugh, for the first time since Margaret's funeral. The sound had pierced through the fog of grief that had surrounded him for 18 months, reminding him that Emily was still alive inside that broken little body. At breakfast, Emily spoke more words than she had in weeks. "The dancing boy is coming back today, isn't he, Daddy?" Her eyes sparkled with anticipation, a light Richard had feared was extinguished forever. "I don't know, sweetheart," he replied carefully, though his heart hoped desperately that the boy would return. "Would you like him to?" "Yes." Emily's response was immediate and emphatic. "He made me feel like I could fly, even sitting down. Can I watch for him from the garden today instead of my room?" Richard agreed, and after breakfast, he personally wheeled Emily outside to her favorite spot near the fountain. She positioned herself with a clear view of the hedge line, her hands clasped in her lap, practically vibrating with excitement. Richard retreated to his study, but found concentration impossible. Through his office window, he watched Emily stare at the hedge with the intensity of a sentinel. Every few minutes, she would adjust her position slightly, making sure she wouldn't miss the boy's arrival. At precisely 3:30, the boy appeared. Richard moved closer to his window, studying the child who had somehow reached his daughter when nothing else could. The boy was younger than Richard had initially thought, maybe 8 or 9 years old. His clothes were the same as yesterday, an oversized olive t-shirt and matching shorts that had seen better days. His bare feet moved silently across the grass as he approached Emily. "Ready for today's show?" the boy called out, his voice carrying easily across the garden. "Yes," Emily practically shouted, her whole face lighting up with joy. This was Richard's moment. He stepped outside, moving purposefully across the patio. The boy froze when he spotted him, his confident smile faltering. Richard could see the child calculating escape routes, his body tensing like a startled deer. "I'm sorry," the boy said quickly, taking a step backward. "I didn't mean to." "It's all right," Richard interrupted, keeping his voice calm but authoritative. "I just want to talk." Emily's head whipped toward her father, panic flashing in her eyes. "Daddy, please don't make him go. He's my friend." The desperation in her voice stopped Richard cold. When had Emily last called anyone her friend? When had she last shown this much emotion about anything? Richard crouched down to the boy's eye level, noting how the child's posture remained wary despite his earlier boldness. Up close, Richard could see the signs of a hard life. Clothes that were clean but worn thin, shoes completely absent, fingernails that spoke of nights spent in places no child should have to sleep. "What's your name?" Richard asked gently. "Jay," the boy replied after a hesitation. "How old are you, Jay?" 9. "I think." "You think?" Richard's heart clenched at the uncertainty in the boy's voice. Jay's eyes flickered to Emily, then down to the grass. "I don't have, birthday cakes or anything. Nobody ever told me exactly when." The casual way Jay mentioned this devastating fact, that no one had ever cared enough to celebrate his birth, hit Richard like a physical blow. "Where do you live, Jay?" Jay's shoulders tensed. "Around. Sometimes at the old bus station when it's raining. Sometimes in the laundry room at the apartments if security doesn't check. I just find places that work." Richard felt Emily's eyes on him, watching his reaction carefully. Her small hands gripped the arms of her wheelchair as she waited to see if her father would destroy this fragile connection that meant everything to her. "He's not bad, Daddy," Emily said urgently. "He makes me happy." Richard looked at his daughter, really looked at her. Her cheeks were flushed with excitement, her posture more upright than it had been in months. There was life in her eyes again, hope in her voice. Whatever this boy was doing, it was working better than any expensive treatment they had tried. "What brought you here yesterday, Jay?" Richard asked. "Why did you start dancing for Emily?" Jay glanced at Emily, drawing courage from her encouraging nod. "I was walking by, and I heard music coming from your garden. Classical music, I think. When I looked over the hedge, I saw her sitting there, and she looked so sad. The saddest person I ever saw." Richard's throat tightened. He had thought Emily's depression was invisible to outsiders, that her pain was contained within the mansion's walls. "I started dancing because when I'm sad, dancing makes me feel better. I thought maybe it would work for her too. At first, I was just dancing by the hedge, but then she smiled a little bit, so I came closer." Jay's voice grew stronger as he spoke. "I wasn't trying to steal anything or cause trouble, sir. She just looked like she needed something good to happen." The simple honesty of this statement, that a homeless child had recognized Emily's need and responded with the only gift he had to offer, overwhelmed Richard. Here was a boy who owned nothing, who slept in bus stations and laundry rooms, who didn't even know his own birthday. Yet he had seen Emily's pain and instinctively offered his joy to heal it. "How do you feel right now, sweetheart?" Richard asked Emily, never taking his eyes off her face. "Happy," she replied without hesitation. "Like I can move again, even if I can't. When Jay dances, it's like the music gets inside me too." Richard's gaze dropped to Emily's feet, and his breath caught. Her toes were twitching slightly inside her shoes. Barely perceptible movement, but definitely real. Dr. Patterson had explained that some patients retained minor reflexive responses, but Richard hadn't seen Emily's feet move since the accident. He looked back at Jay, seeing the boy with new eyes. This child had somehow reached past Emily's physical limitations to touch something deeper, her spirit, her will to engage with life again. In 2 brief encounters, Jay had accomplished what teams of specialists had failed to achieve. "Jay," Richard said slowly, his voice thick with emotion he didn't try to hide, "would you like to stay for dinner?" The boy's eyes went wide with shock. "Sir, I think," Richard continued, standing and brushing grass from his knees, "that Emily would like you to stay, and I think there's a lot more we need to talk about." Emily clapped her hands together, her face radiant with joy. "Yes, Jay, please stay. Please." Jay looked between father and daughter, still processing this unexpected turn of events. "Are you sure? I don't have fancy clothes or table manners or anything like that." Richard smiled, the first genuine smile he had felt in months. "I think we can work around that. The question is, are you willing to trust us?" Jay's grin slowly returned, transforming his entire face. "If Emily wants me to stay, then yes, sir. I'd like that very much." As the three of them headed toward the mansion, Richard felt something shift inside his chest. For the first time since the accident, he felt like they were moving toward healing instead of away from it. Dinner at the Hale mansion that evening was unlike any meal the household had ever witnessed. Jay sat at the massive mahogany table, his small frame dwarfed by the ornate dining chair, his eyes wide with wonder at the crystal chandelier hanging overhead. He had washed his hands and face in the guest bathroom, and Mrs. Chun had found him a clean shirt from donations intended for charity. Still too large, but better than his worn olive t-shirt. Emily insisted her wheelchair be positioned directly next to Jay's chair, breaking the formal seating arrangement that had governed family dinners for years. She barely touched her food, too excited about having a real friend at their table to focus on eating. Instead, she peppered Jay with questions about his dancing, his travels around the city, and his adventures finding places to sleep. Richard found himself studying Jay throughout the meal, noting how the boy's natural manners emerged despite his lack of formal training. Jay thanked Mrs. Chun repeatedly for each course, complimented the food genuinely, and never grabbed or rushed despite obvious hunger. When Emily asked about his parents, Jay's expression grew guarded. "I don't really remember my mom," he said quietly. "I was little when she left. My dad, he tried for a while, but he had problems. Drinking problems. One day I came home from school, and he was just gone. Left a note, saying he couldn't take care of me anymore." The casual way Jay recounted this abandonment, as if it were simply another fact of life, made Richard's chest ache. Here was a child who had been thrown away by the people who should have protected him, yet somehow he had retained the capacity for joy, generosity, and compassion. "How long have you been on your own?" Richard asked. 2 years, maybe 3. It's hard to keep track. I got pretty good at it, though. I know where the warm places are when it gets cold, which restaurants throw away good food, and which security guards are nice versus mean. Emily reached over and touched Jay's hand. "That sounds scary." Jay shrugged, but Richard caught the flash of vulnerability in his eyes. "You get used to it. Besides, dancing helps. When things get really bad, I find somewhere private and dance until I feel better. Movement makes everything lighter somehow." After dinner, they moved to the garden for what had become Jay's daily performance. But tonight felt different. Emily positioned herself closer than before, and Richard noticed she was unconsciously moving her upper body in rhythm with Jay's steps. Her shoulders swayed, her arms gestured, her head turned to follow his movements. Jay seemed to sense her increased engagement and modified his routine accordingly. He began incorporating movements that Emily could mirror from her wheelchair: arm circles, shoulder rolls, head nods. It was subtle, but Richard realized Jay was instinctively making his dance inclusive, creating a way for Emily to participate rather than just observe. "Emily, try this," Jay called out, demonstrating a graceful arm movement that looked like swimming through air. Emily lifted her arms and copied him, her face concentrated with effort and delight. The movement was simple, but it was the first time since the accident that she had initiated physical activity on her own. "Beautiful," Jay exclaimed. "You're a natural dancer. I can tell." Emily beamed at the compliment, then surprised everyone by attempting the movement again, this time with more confidence and flair. As the performance continued, Richard noticed Emily growing more animated. Her breathing deepened, color returned to her cheeks, and her eyes sparkled with an energy he hadn't seen in over a year. When Jay spun in a wide circle, Emily actually tried to spin her wheelchair, managing a quarter turn before stopping, breathless but laughing. Then it happened. Jay was demonstrating a movement that involved reaching toward the sky with both arms, when Emily suddenly placed her hands on the armrests of her wheelchair and pushed. Her body lifted several inches out of the seat, her arms extending upward in mirror of Jay's pose. For 3 incredible seconds, she supported her own weight before collapsing back into the chair, panting but grinning triumphantly. "I did it," she gasped. "Jay, did you see? I lifted myself up." Richard's world tilted. In 18 months of physical therapy, Emily had never shown this kind of strength or motivation. Yet here she was, pushing her body beyond what doctors had said was possible, driven by nothing more than the desire to dance with her friend. Jay whooped with joy, dropping to his knees beside Emily's wheelchair. "You were amazing. That was like flying." "I felt like I was flying too," Emily whispered, tears of happiness streaming down her face. Richard knelt beside them, his throat too tight to speak immediately. When he finally found his voice, it was rough with emotion. "Emily, that was incredible. How did it feel?" "Like I remembered something I thought I lost," she replied. "When Jay dances, it's like he's showing me that my body can still do things, even different things than before." That night, after Jay had been settled in the guest room with clothes, toiletries, and the first real bed he had slept in for years, Richard sat in his study trying to process what he had witnessed. He called Dr. Patterson, despite the late hour. "Doctor, I need you to see Emily again. Something extraordinary has happened." "Mr. Hale, we've discussed this. Emily's condition is permanent. I don't want to give you false hope. She lifted herself out of her wheelchair tonight, under her own power, for 3 full seconds." Silence stretched across the phone line. Finally, Dr. Patterson spoke, his voice carefully professional but tinged with curiosity. "That's unusual. Residual upper body strength can sometimes be more than initially assessed, but the motivation to use it. It's not just physical, doctor. She's engaged with life again. She's laughing, participating, pushing herself, all because of a 9-year-old boy who showed her that movement can be joyful instead of clinical." Richard could hear Dr. Patterson making notes. "I'd like to see her next week. And Mr. Hale, whatever you're doing, don't stop. Sometimes healing comes from directions we never expect." After hanging up, Richard walked quietly to Jay's room and peered through the slightly open door. The boy was fast asleep, curled up in clean sheets, his face peaceful for the first time since Richard had met him. On the nightstand beside the bed, Jay had carefully folded his old clothes, unable to throw away the few possessions he owned even though new ones awaited him in the morning. Richard made a decision that would change all their lives forever. Tomorrow, he would make Jay's residency permanent. But more than that, he would give this remarkable child what he had never had: a family, security, and the chance to discover what his extraordinary gift for bringing joy to others might become with proper nurturing. The mansion felt different as Richard walked back to his own room. For the first time in 18 months, it felt like a home where healing was possible, where hope had taken root and begun to grow. 3 months after Jay's arrival, the Hale mansion buzzed with life in ways it hadn't since before Margaret's death. The sound of laughter echoed through hallways that had been silent for too long, and music, real, joyful music, played in the garden every afternoon. Emily's transformation had been nothing short of miraculous. Dr. Patterson visited weekly now, documenting progress that defied medical explanation. Emily could lift herself from her wheelchair for nearly 30 seconds at a time. Her upper body strength had increased dramatically, and most remarkably, she had regained some sensation in her lower back and thighs. While her legs remained paralyzed, the numbness that had extended up her torso was slowly receding. "It's unprecedented," Dr. Patterson told Richard during their latest consultation. "Emily's neurological responses suggest that some neural pathways that we assumed were completely severed may have actually been compressed or inflamed. The combination of physical activity, emotional healing, and sheer determination seems to be encouraging recovery we didn't think was possible." But Emily's physical improvements were only part of the miracle. Her spirit had returned in full force. She laughed constantly, chattered endlessly about her daily adventures with Jay, and had even begun showing interest in modified dance classes that Jay helped her design. She no longer spent hours staring out windows in silent despair. Instead, she spent her days engaged, active, and radiantly happy. Jay's transformation was equally dramatic. Proper nutrition had filled out his thin frame. Regular sleep had erased the dark circles under his eyes, and the constant fear of where he would spend the night had been replaced with the security of belonging somewhere. Richard had enrolled him in Westfield Academy, the city's most prestigious private school, where Jay's natural intelligence and surprising literacy skills had impressed his teachers. The boy who had learned to read by studying discarded newspapers and magazines was now devouring classic literature, excelling in mathematics, and showing remarkable aptitude for music theory. But it was his continued gift for movement and joy that made him truly special. Jay had begun teaching other children at Emily's modified dance classes. Word had spread through the community about the remarkable boy who could help disabled children connect with their bodies in new ways. Parents brought kids with cerebral palsy, autism, and various physical limitations to sessions Jay led in the mansion's converted ballroom. "He doesn't see disabilities," observed Mrs. Rodriguez, whose daughter Sophia had spina bifida. "He sees each child's unique way of moving and builds from there." Sophia has never felt proud of her body before, but Jay makes her feel like a dancer. Richard often watched these sessions from the doorway, marveling at Jay's intuitive understanding of how to reach each child. The boy who had grown up with nothing had developed an extraordinary capacity for giving. He approached each child with patience, creativity, and unwavering belief in their potential for joy through movement. The mansion itself had changed to accommodate its new life. The formal dining room hosted community dinners twice a week, bringing together families of children in Jay's dance program. The ballroom, unused since Margaret's death, had been transformed into a therapeutic dance studio with specialized equipment. The swimming pool, once covered and ignored, now hosted water therapy sessions that Jay had suggested after researching aquatic rehabilitation. Richard found himself changing too. The sharp-edged businessman who had measured success only in profit margins was discovering the satisfaction of making a different kind of investment. He had established the Emily Hale Foundation for Adaptive Movement Therapy, hiring professional therapists to work alongside Jay in developing new approaches to rehabilitation through dance and creative movement. But perhaps the most profound change was in how the family had learned to talk about their losses. One evening, as the three of them sat in the garden watching the sunset, Emily finally asked the question that had haunted her since the accident. "Daddy, why did Mommy die and leave us?" Richard felt his chest tighten with familiar pain, but this time he didn't deflect or change the subject. Jay's presence had taught them all that truth, even painful truth, could be shared without destroying hope. "Mommy didn't choose to leave us, sweetheart. Sometimes terrible things happen that nobody can control or prevent. A man who had been drinking alcohol hit our car, and Mommy was hurt too badly for the doctors to save her." Emily nodded solemnly, processing this information with the wisdom that trauma had forced upon her young mind. "I used to think maybe she left because I got hurt and couldn't dance anymore." "Oh, Emily." Richard pulled her close, his voice thick with emotion. "Mommy would be so proud of how you've learned to dance in new ways. She loved watching you move, and I know she would love watching you now, helping other kids discover their own joy in movement." Jay, who had been quietly listening, reached over and took Emily's hand. "My mom left because she couldn't handle taking care of me. My dad left because he was sick with drinking, like the man who hurt you and your mommy. But here's what I learned living on the streets. Sometimes losing people teaches us how precious the people who stay really are." The wisdom in Jay's words, spoken with the authority of someone who had survived abandonment and found his way to love again, settled over them like a blessing. Richard realized that this child, who had been discarded by his own parents, had somehow learned to transform pain into compassion, loneliness into connection, and loss into profound gratitude for what remained. As autumn approached, Richard made an announcement that surprised no one who had watched their unconventional family form. He had filed legal papers to officially adopt Jay, making him Emily's brother-in-law as well as in heart. "Are you sure you want a family like us?" Emily asked Jay during the celebration dinner Mrs. Chun had prepared. "We're kind of broken, and we'll probably always be different from other families." Jay grinned, that same radiant smile that had first captured Emily's attention months ago. "I think we're not broken anymore. We're just put together in a different way than most families, and different can be pretty amazing." That night, as Richard tucked Emily into bed, she made a request that filled his heart to overflowing. "Daddy, will you tell me a story about Mommy? A happy story about how she used to dance." For the first time since Margaret's death, Richard found himself able to share memories without drowning in grief. He told Emily about their first dance at their wedding, about how Margaret had tried to teach him salsa in their kitchen, about the way she used to dance with infant Emily in her arms. As he spoke, Emily's eyes grew heavy with sleep, but her face remained peaceful and content. When he finished the story, she whispered, "I think Mommy would like Jay very much." "I think she would love him," Richard agreed. "Just like we do." Walking through the mansion after Emily had fallen asleep, Richard paused at the portrait of Margaret that hung in the main hallway. For months after her death, he had avoided looking at it, unable to bear the reminder of what he had lost. Tonight, for the first time, he saw something different in her painted smile. He saw approval, love, and perhaps even gratitude that her family had found their way back to joy. Margaret had always believed that love was meant to be shared, multiplied, given away freely. In welcoming Jay into their family, in opening their home to other families struggling with disability and loss, in choosing healing over bitterness, Richard felt like he was honoring his wife's memory in the truest possible way. The mansion that had once felt like a tomb had become a sanctuary where broken people learned to dance again, where families discovered new definitions of wholeness, and where a homeless boy's gift for joy had created miracles that no amount of money could have purchased. Outside in the garden, the fountain continued its eternal dance with gravity, water rising and falling in patterns that never grew old. It was the perfect metaphor for their family's journey. Sometimes life lifted you up, sometimes it brought you down, but the movement itself, the willingness to keep dancing through it all, was what made the journey beautiful. The end.